you ever just really wanted to wear a beautiful period gown, but also wanted to be a little socially acceptable? This is a dilemma I struggle with daily, so I thought I'd do a little experiment and bring historical silhouettes into modern fashion. Because let's face it, history has done some pretty stunning things that we seem to have forgotten all about, and I think it's high time we change that. The weather is warming here in merry New York, and I think it's time for a new summer frock, based, of course, on the styles of the 18th century. You cannot convince me that these big pleated skirts and the little peaked bodices aren't ridiculously flattering. So I started with a sketch based on this 18th century style printed linen I picked up when I was last in England. For the pattern I worked mainly from Janet Arnold, primarily this gown. There are quite a few in this book with similar piece shapes, but I've worked with this pattern before, and I felt like for this project it would be nice to go with something that I know. So this is the fabric that I'm using, and I'm lining it with this plain linen I picked up a while ago from somewhere on 39th Street. Historically, the lining layer would probably have been treated with wheat or rice starch in order to stiffen the bodice, but since I won't be wearing a protective layer of stays and chemise, and I'd like this dress to be washable, I decided to add a layer of medium-weight fusible interfacing instead. This gives a similar stiffness to the bodice without the whole lining needing to be restarched after every wash. Since I'll be wearing this dress without stays, there are a few structural things I should address. Firstly, I did make a mock-up of this pattern beforehand, just to fit the pattern correctly. I had to change some of the proportions of the original pattern slightly, like resetting the shoulder straps and arm's eye, and repositioning the neckline since I won't have stays pushing my bust out of its natural position. The extra layer of interfacing and the fitted nature of the bodice should provide some support in terms of giving the dress that sleek 18th century shape, but I don't plan to add any additional support garments. Quick side note disclaimer that I was actually in medical stays for many years growing up, so my proportions are slightly more unnatural than the average modern figure. So it'll be interesting to see if this garment holds the same historical charm outside of its 18th century context. Okay, so now that the bodice is cut out, I'm going ahead and fusing the interfacing to the lining layer. Only the net pattern is stiffened, with the seam allowances left soft to turn more easily. I'm now cutting out the skirt panels. The original pattern has 6 skirt panels with a seam at center front, but since my fabric is wide enough and I'm not trying to be strictly historical here, I decided to just cut the front panel on the fold and eliminate that seam. And so here I have all 5 of my skirt panels cut out. I've done this tricky thing where I've made sure to have one selvage edge to every seam, so you'll see later that finishing the edges of the skirt seams will be super simple. Also, just for the sake of historical amusement, I've shorn off the fuzzy bits to have a nice clean selvage, just like on historical hand-woven fabrics. This isn't necessary, but I thought it just looks nicer. And so here I've gone ahead and pinned my interfaced lining layer to my outer fabric layer. You can see it's got quite a nice stiffness to it so far. These 2 layers will get pad stitched into place so that both are secured together as one. Yes, theoretically you could just make up the bodice and lining layers separately, stitch them together at the edges and bag them out, but that's a bit too modern a technique for my taste. I'm going to use the more historical method of treating both lining and fabric layers as one and finishing the raw seams separately, the process of which you shall see shortly. The pad stitching is effectively just a basting stitch. It holds the 2 layers together so they don't shift around during the assembly process, and will be pulled out once the layers are in a secure enough state. If you need a little tutorial in pad stitching, or any other historical stitching technique for that matter, I recommend consulting any of the 3 V&A books on 17th century dress and doublet patterns. They all have a quick introductory page on various historical stitches, and are how I refreshed myself on this one since I had inevitably forgotten how to do it. As I'm stitching, I'm gently working the bodice into the curved shape I want it to sit in when worn against the body, sort of pre-programming it to hold more naturally to shape. This is a technique I learned from period men's tailoring, but it's quite a useful tip to apply to any structured garment, I think. The next step is to finish the outer edges of the bodice. These are the edges that won't be finished in a seam, so the waist and neck edges. This includes the edge of the shoulder strap that makes up part of the neckline, and it's done by tucking the seam allowances between the layers and slip stitching them together. The waist curve is clipped to ease around the curve, and you may have to clip some of your pad stitching if you also got a little bit over-enthusiastic with it and went too close to the edges. The slip stitch should catch only the seam allowances and not actually prick through the outer layers. There's a 1/4-inch tuck in the center back panels of the original pattern, a style feature on gowns of the late 18th century. It's a nice little historical detail that I wanted to include, so I'm just marking out the lines for this onto my pattern with transfer paper. I did do some historically accurate pouncing in one of my previous videos, which I shall link here if you're curious. I'm now going to backstitch the seam into place by hand with waxed linen thread. Since it goes around a curve, I find that hand stitching is much easier to control and the result is much neater. But then I'm way more adept at handwork than I am on a machine. If you're super comfortable on a machine, and tiny curved seams don't scare you like they terrify me, then by all means go right ahead. I'll meet up with you in about 20 minutes. Next it's time to assemble the bodice. I promise I'm going to do this by machine. So here I'm just pinning together the center front. I should note that the original gown closes with eyelets up the center front, but because we're being all modern here, I decided to zip it up the center back instead, so I'm going to leave that open for now. Nevertheless, I've decided to preserve the center front seam. Now it's time to assemble the skirt. Yes, I know my seam allowances don't match precisely since I cut them by eye, but since I'm stitching along my marked lines and will be clipping the seam allowances later, it doesn't really matter. All the skirt panels are now stitched together, except for the center back seam where the zipper will go in later. I'm now pleating it onto my dress form. Since the center front panel is cut with a tricky curve at the waist edge, Janet suggests doing the pleating on a form in order to ensure that everything hangs correctly, and I can attest this is definitely a good idea. I pleated it flat for the mock-up, and there was definitely some wonky business that ensued. My pleats here ended up to be around 3/8 of an inch wide, but it's up to you to decide what you think looks best. Smaller pleats are more historically accurate, and can go as small as 1/4 of an inch if you have the patience, but it can also be 1/2 to 1 inch, or more if you prefer. It's your dress, so do what makes you happy. The pleats are quickly secured with a basting stitch before the bodice is added and pinned into position. Then I'm attaching the bodice to the skirt with a secure back stitch, being careful only to catch the lining of the bodice so the stitching is invisible from the front. If you don't mind a bit of top stitching and you're neat with it, you might try top stitching the skirt on by machine, but be warned that this isn't a very 18th century detail. Now that the skirt is secure, you can remove your basting thread and trim the excess skirt fabric. Historically, this edge was left raw, and I understand why. Hemming would create a bulky edge right at the waist, right where you don't want bulk. If you have an overlock machine, you can finish this edge discreetly that way, but since I don't have such a modern contraption, I'm going to crawl back into my history hole to finish my edge here, using some rabbit skin glue. You can still buy this at art supply stores since it's used for canvas sizing, but it was also used frequently historically to finish off raw edges. This stuff is quite potent, so be sure to keep the wet edges away from your other fabrics until it dries. Though I hear there's also this thing called fray check that sounds like it'll work just as well. Off camera, I inserted a 19-inch invisible zipper into the center back seam. And now it's time to finish off the inside seams. I'm just trimming the under layers of seam allowance, then the uppermost layer is folded over the others to encase all of the raw edges. Then this is felled or whip-stitched into place, catching only the lining layer and not going through to the front of the bodice. After trying on the dress and repositioning the straps appropriately, I'm now going to sew them onto the bodice for real. I'm stitching them with the lining sides facing so that the seam allowance faces to the front, but leaving the fabric layer free. You'll see later, I'm going to attempt a little 18th century trick at setting in the sleeves. But first, I'm going to procrastinate the sleeves by making some ruffles. I picked up this 1 inch wide double-faced satin ribbon that I'm planning to box pleat and attach to the neckline and cuffs, a common decoration technique on 18th century gowns. Okay, fine, I'll do the sleeves now. These are left unstiffened, with just the layer of fabric and linen lining. I actually nicked the pattern for this from a different gown in Janet's book, since the sleeve pattern to this gown wouldn't fit into my adjusted arm's eye, and all my attempts to reshape it proved unsuccessful. This sleeve was a much closer fit to my bodice, and only required slight adjustments. Once I've inserted the lining into the sleeve, it's time to finish off the cuff edge. I've clipped into the seam allowance since the pattern curves around the elbow just to make the line fold smoothly. Then I'm running stitching it into place since I plan to cover this edge with ruffles and it won't be seen in the end. Come to think of it, I could have also just done this on the neck edge as well since that will also have frills, but oh well, what's done is done. So after the sleeves are put together, it's time for the moment of truth in setting them in. Just kidding, I was determined to make these work after my 7th sleeve mock-up. Since the arm's eye is shaped roughly like a semicircle, you stitch the bottom flat edge down first. I'm doing this by hand with a backstitch, since it's a tricky spot to maneuver and I just find it easier. But again, if you're a machine wizard and feel comfortable doing this by machine, by all means, go right ahead. Then the upper curved edge is pinned on top of the strap lining, taking a pleat or two where there may be any extra fullness. The fabric layer of the strap then gets folded and stitched on top of the sleeve to hide all of the raw edges. Next, I'm pinning my lengths of ribbon pleating onto the neck and cuff edges of the dress, and tacking them into place with a running stitch. Now all that's left is to finish cleaning up some raw edges. First I'm trimming down all but the topmost seam allowances on the arm's eye, then folding them in and felling them into place. Then I'm finishing the center back edge by tacking down the extra flap of the zipper to hide those raw edges. And finally I'm finishing off the skirt seams. If you remember, I intentionally cut one edge of each pair in the seams on a selvage, so I can just fold the clean selvage over the raw edge in a neater, flatter seam than having to turn it twice. Alternatively, again, if you have access to an overlock machine, that'll probably save you the hour-and-a-half of hemming, but if not, I assure you that this method is just as effective. Finally, I put the dress on the stand to even up the hemline, then put in the hem by hand, and filmed none of it, so here she is in all her finished glory. I hope you enjoyed watching this little experiment, and that perhaps it's inspired you to create your own new historically inspired summer ensemble. If you do, I'd love to see. Leave me a comment down below or tag me on Instagram, and perhaps we can start a trend. #historicalsummer, anyone? Anyway, best of luck to you if you're off to do some sewing now. I read that I'm supposed to remind people to subscribe, so do that if you like, and I shall see you next time for some more historical sewing adventures.